Hello, everybody. My name is Mary Jean. I am a One Young World Ambassador, and I'm one of the 2019 Open Internet for Democracy Leaders Fellows, a program designed to develop the capacities of fellows to promote a free and open internet necessary to strengthen democratic engagement. Welcome to the Global Communiqué's in-depth conversations. Today, we have a very special guest joining us from South Africa. She is Professor Thuli Madonsela. She needs no introduction, but for the sake of procedure, she is the Law Faculty Trust Chair in Social Justice at Stellenbosch University, South Africa. She is the former Public Protector of South Africa. She's an activist in issues of constitutionalism, democratic governance, human rights, and social justice. She is one of the drafters of the South African Constitution in the early 1990s. And was named as one of Time 100's most influential people in the world in 2014. And in 2016 was Forbes Africa Person of the Year. She has also been recognized as a One Young World Counsellor and has received numerous awards, including Transparency International's Integrity Award. And she has also received a number of honorary degrees. I could go on. Professor Madonsela, it really is a pleasure to have you today.
The honor is mine, Mary Jane. Thank you for this privilege.
In this discussion, I will separate the discussion under three sections. Firstly, the constitutionality of lockdowns in Southern Africa in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, in light of the most recent open letter you wrote to the South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa. Secondly, the importance of digital rights and viewing information communication technologies, namely the open internet, through a democratic and social justice lens. We will also briefly discuss recent global events, including the Black Lives Matter protests that erupted across the world. And finally, your reflections on your time as the Public Protector of South Africa. So I will get straight into it. You recently penned an open letter to the South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa, in mid-June, a letter that ended up going viral in South Africa. In the letter, you analyzed the COVID-19 lockdown through a social justice lens, in which you wrote, and I quote, "The two key challenges to the lockdown are social justice and reasonableness, which are both protected in the Constitution," end quote. It appears your major concern was the social impact of the lockdown. Can you please tell us what was the motivation behind the letter, and what did you see as having gone wrong in the lockdown regulations in South Africa?
Thank you. My key concerns regarding the lockdown was that although government was winning the battle in the courts of law, it was losing the battle in the court of public opinion. And if you have to govern sustainably, you have to govern in accordance with the will of the people. If it will take coercion to get people to comply with everything you do, the rule of law is lost and the sustainability of democracy is threatened. The reason there seemed to be a growing gap between government and the people was twofold, as indicated. One was social justice, that these lockdown regulations treat all of us the same, but the impact is different. Those who are in the margins of society are thrown further off the grid. For example, at some stage, the lockdown regulations did not allow anybody to buy warm food and certain things except on the internet. At that stage, I'd never been out of my house and I was able to do everything. In fact, since the lockdown was imposed, I've only been out of my house 4 times. That's the extent of privilege that I have. But the average person who doesn't have a privileged life needs to go to a taxi, needs to go and buy these things. And also the special disparities of apartheid in South Africa means villages don't have nearby shops, and villages don't have the internet, and they don't have access to online shopping and online services. So that was the one part. The social justice part was that a whole lot of people were being thrown off, and most of the impacted were ordinary people. And a lot of the people who depend on what we refer to as gig work, or informal commerce have really been thrown out. And the package that government has generously laid out to cushion people from the impact of these rules does not cover some of the people who are informally employed, because they only cover people who have formal businesses that are registered with SARS, with our revenue system, or cover unemployed. So the missing middle is always the missing middle. We had fees must fall, principally because the missing middle was forgotten. Again, the missing middle has been forgotten. If you're unemployed, getting 350 Rand is not much, but it's a movement from where you were all this time to government is placing you. But if you are self-employed, at that stage, hairdressers were not allowed to work, and people in the tourism industry were not allowed to work, including guides in the national parks, etc. 350 Rand was too little. So that's that part of the problem. The unreasonable part mostly relates to the fact that the architects of these rules seem to have no clue about impact on social life and family life. For example, you see in regulations in South Africa, you are told that you can only leave your house for this, that, and that, which means anything that's not mentioned in those rules, you can't leave your house for that. That means you can't leave your house to visit your relatives. And when it comes to Regulation 35 regulating funerals, the state tells you who can attend a funeral, and that's unreasonable. What is reasonable is the fact that the government of South Africa has said there can only be 50 people attending, and we all understand that we've got to restrict. In fact, we even think 50 might be too big, but that is, as it may be, has been allowed, and we're grateful for it. But to then say only this kind of relative can attend. In my case, for example, shortly after writing that letter, my cousin-in-law, who in Zulu would be my brother-in-law, died. I couldn't get a permit to go and bury him because the law was very clear that there's no bearing of brothers-in-law and cousins-in-law. I could only go and bury my own husband or my own mother-in-law, father-in-law. So that's the unreasonable part of it. Those are just examples of in what way were some of these rules unreasonable, and the need to relax them, but more importantly, they need to democratize the process so that more voices define how we respond to COVID-19.
That's very interesting, particularly the element of the social justice element that you just mentioned, because it somehow alludes to the World Bank's Africa's Pulse biannual report for spring 2020, where they recommended that policymakers need to develop a two-pronged strategy. On the one hand, saving lives, and on the other hand, protecting livelihoods. So like you said in your letter, and I quote here, you need to hear them, Mr. President. You need to hear Gogo, translated to Grandma Dlamini, who has been stopped from making the 350 Rand a week she got selling hot amagwinya, that is fat cakes, or meals at taxi ranks, end quote. And for me, it somehow really alludes to the World Bank's biannual report. So my question is, how does one reconcile this two-pronged strategy that the World Bank is talking about of saving lives while at the same time protecting livelihoods in light of what you observed as well in your open letter?
Well, basically, in my letter, I'm saying it's a balancing exercise, and it's a difficult one. We do understand that it's a huge task. But firstly, to say that my approach goes beyond the World Bank's approach. It's more in line with the World Health Organization's approach. It's life, livelihoods, and social life. Because if you look at just commerce and health, a whole lot of things fall through the cracks. And you're not going to think about, for example, the social fabric of society dies when people can't have social intercourse. And we don't only interact when we're pursuing commerce, and we don't only interact when we're pursuing health. We interact because we're social beings, like ants, like elephants. Right. We thrive from doing things together. And I think that's partly part of the problem, this dichotomizing it into life and livelihoods and forgetting that between these two, there is life, which is social life. But having said that, Mary Jean, it's a very difficult exercise. And even as I wrote that letter to the president, I was not suggesting that they're being idiotic or they're deliberately doing something wrong. I was suggesting that perhaps they should bring more players into the policy design. If you see, a lot of these policies are designed by doctors and politicians, politicians, and bureaucrats. And doctors, politicians, and bureaucrats don't have all the answers. In South Africa, we have a law called the Disaster Management Act. The architects of that law understood that you will need a whole range of players to pool their wisdom together to anticipate the future. Here at Stellenbosch University, working together with colleagues under the Social Justice and COVID-19 Policy Monitoring Alliance, we call ourselves SCOPRA. We've designed a tool that government could use to predict the impact of policies before you implement them. And we're pretty pleased that more people are warming up to the idea of using predictive data analytics to predict the likely impact of a policy you're planning to implement before you implement it. Instead of implementing something and then realizing that it is too harsh on one group in society, implement it first in the virtual space and then realize that the consequences of your policy are going to be terrible, and then pull back. And we have suggested this matrix. It's called Social Justice Impact Assessment Matrix. It asks you a whole lot of questions. Have you thought about different circumstances of people in planning this policy? Have you collected data about the situation of different groups in society and how your planned regulation of policy is going to impact on each of them? Are you aware of whether it will exacerbate existing inequalities or it will reduce them? And the idea is to just try and help them to plan better and avoid leaving more people behind or pushing those who are already left behind further behind.
In respect of the lockdown measures, which were almost implemented all across the world, there was drawn directly from China because this is where it initially went straight into lockdown following the outbreak in Wuhan. And I just wonder, from a democratic governance perspective, what are your thoughts on drawing practices from a country such as China, whose context differs fundamentally from those of democratic countries such as South Africa? And what are the other ways South Africa and other African countries, or indeed other countries around the world, could have considered in handling this unprecedented historic outbreak?
You've hit the nail on its head. We have to learn from each other, but not copy from each other. I think learning from each other is different from copying from each other because circumstances differ. I think the virus may have come from China, but solutions should not have been made in China. But again, we have to be fair to the governments of the world. That the first reaction had to be influenced by China to a certain extent, because they needed to be agile in responding, because being tardy could have allowed the virus to gain an upper hand, and by the time they responded, it would have been too late. But the first batch of responses, the first month, could have been made in China, but thereafter, there was a need to use emerging data from our own shores and using that data to plan more effectively. For example, China could lock down people completely for a limited period of time. And I suspect for me, The reason it was able to do so are several. One, it's not a democratic state, and therefore they can do command and control without constitutional constraints. Mm-hmm. But as part of the Sustainable Development Goals, and before then Millennium Development Goals, China's strategy of combating poverty and inequality had focused on upgrading villages and turning them into cities and putting everyone on the internet. And therefore, when they decided that government services were going on the internet, and shopping or commerce was going on the internet, it was possible for China to do that. They have the infrastructure to do that. And thirdly, they are a relatively homogeneous society as compared to ours. And therefore, in South Africa, for example, the China approach did not work. We went for what was called a hard lockdown, but it wasn't. In practice, it wasn't, because it was impossible. The government still said you can go to a supermarket, because people had to walk. Not everyone was on the internet. And in that space, people were infected in malls. Secondly, because we hadn't made progress on poverty, people were hungry. The moment we had a lockdown, those who were living from hand to mouth immediately needed food. And then there was a whole army of people delivering food parcels without constraints. People were moving from province to province, carrying the virus from province to province. Then there was SASSA grants, people queuing, standing next to each other, back to back. That impacted our way of trying to handle the virus. And again, these are thoughts coming from experience. Mm-hmm. And we will face more viruses, we will face more disasters. All we can hope from our government is that we've learned something. South Africa was different from the other African countries in that in South Africa, because we're an urbanized country, there were too many people who depend on work. And if you cut them off from work, you have a disaster. Whereas in the other African countries where people still live in the rural areas, even if you cut them off from work, they could still depend on agriculture, which now we are saying in South Africa, everyone should have some kind of baseline garden where at least when there's no opportunity to shop, basic nutrition can be provided from your own food garden.
Right. So shifting gears a bit into the use of ICTs as both a tool for democratic engagement as well as democratic disengagement. In other instances, governments, including the South African government, are resorting to mobile location data to contain the spread of the virus. So governments are accessing individuals' data, and this is justified as for the public good. Is relinquishing the right to privacy justifiable for the public good?
It's a very difficult question. I will say so, in that public good is often about us relinquishing some of our private spaces for common good. At the same time, relinquishing our private spaces where there are evil people in government, those people can use that power destructively. I guess you need two things. You need a certain level of intrusion into our private spaces, but with transparency, we need to know what is being done with that data, who has access to that data, and to what extent is the data protected. For example, South Africa just passed into law now, or operationalized a law that was passed several years ago. It's called Protection of Access to Personal Information Act. And obviously, if government collects any information on any citizen, they have two responsibilities. One is make sure that that information is protected. Whoever collects information on someone has a duty to make sure that that information does not go to hands it was not meant to. The second duty they have is that they can't share that information with anyone, and they can't use that information for reasons other than those that this data was collected for. But that's, there's too many other people that collect information on people, And therefore, yes, we live in the information age, which is a huge enabler in terms of democratizing and providing sunshine, which Justice Brandeis once said, sunshine is the best disinfectant. So it is a disinfectant, but it must be handled with care, like all disinfectants.
And on March 18, 2020, in an effort to confront the COVID-19 pandemic, the South African government, under the Disaster Management Act, put into place a set of regulations that criminalized disinformation about COVID-19, with punishment being either fines, imprisonment, or a combination of the two. The issue of disinformation has been a cause for concern and recognized as such by bodies including the World Health Organization, especially during this time of COVID-19, where the dissemination of accurate information is important. With that said, doesn't the South African government's decision to criminalize disinformation under the state of disaster regulations have a chilling effect on freedom of expression or freedom of speech?
It does. In fact, at the beginning, people were just too scared even to educate each other, which had a chilling effect, not just on the freedom of speech, but also on the awareness raising, because then emphasis was on the state only as the sharer of information and the state only to command and control us. That diminished space for us to be peer educators of each other. More recently, people are starting again to share information on COVID-19, but a lot more people stopped sharing very good videos about what you need to do to protect yourself and what you needed to do just to boost your immunity system in the event that you come across the virus. So that's just on COVID-19 itself. Then there's a question of democracy. In a democracy, access to information and the ability to share information, which is freedom of information, is the lifeblood of democracy. Again, it's a balancing thing. In evil hands, a good tool becomes a dangerous tool.
And still on this point, as you mentioned, democracy requires the free flow of viewpoints, and in the contemporary world, this is achieved through a free and open internet where citizens can freely share ideas and debate them. What are the implications of, still on this, the criminalization of disinformation in South Africa on protecting open internet freedoms in South Africa and the precedent it serves for the rest of Southern Africa and indeed Africa at large?
I do think that it was an overkill.
Okay.
Prof concerned that people were going to spread incorrect information that could lead to public panic. And with public panic, it's difficult to govern. But I suspect, again, those are some of those laws that are borrowed from governments where everything is controlled by the state and the state thinks it knows everything. The truth is, no state knows everything. People are not, they're not employed in government or elected into government because they know more than us. They're elected because they can be stewards. And a steward doesn't need to know everything. A steward is an integrator. And a steward is also an impartial role player who can make sure that every voice is heard and information is shared. Going forward, as corpora, we just generally against criminalization, and others responded to my recent article where I am saying it's improper that we have more than 250,000 people with criminal records in a country where certain jobs require you not to have a criminal record. And the majority of the people who have been arrested and who now have a record are poor. And not because it's only the poor that violated the COVID-19 rules. It's because it's just easier to catch the poor. And even the police targeted the poor. You didn't see many people on the suburbs being stopped on the road and asked, what is in your car? Or who were walking, asked, where are you going? That was done in the townships. And as a result, you have the bulk of ordinary people with criminal records. The same thing with access to information. You will find that the majority of people that can end up in jail for sharing information are ordinary people who might not even know that it's illegal to share this information. The rule of law requires that people should be involved in the making of laws, and that the laws should be intelligible and accessible to all people. And the third thing with COVID-19 is that we are making regulations that have the status of laws, in that they're creating crimes. Ordinarily, a crime should be debated and by society as a whole through parliament. And through that debate, there will be people for making that conduct criminal, and there'll be people against it. And when finally we decide that we want to criminalize that conduct, there would have been the kind of debate that is educative in nature, and people would know about it. With the COVID-19, you have a bunch of people sitting around the corner coming up overnight, and suddenly something that was perfectly legitimate last night, this morning is now criminal. People don't know where it came from, and people are now being arrested. Again, I'm not against government. I'm just saying people have to think before they do these things. To say a law that is only known in the books, and people only get to know that they're violating the law when they're arrested, it's not fair. But it also undermines the rule of law, because then practically everyone becomes a criminal. I mean, when I was young, there was a stigma attached to having been arrested. But when you criminalize everything, there won't be a stigma to having been arrested, because pretty much everyone would have gone to jail for some or other stupid reason. And that reduces the status of laws and undermines the rule of law.
Thank you for that. We will now briefly turn to recent global protests on issues of race. And of course, issues of race are significant in South Africa as well. A few weeks ago, Black Lives Matter protests swept across the United States and later in other cities across the world, in which people bemoaned racism in general. Having grown up during apartheid and later witnessed the transition from apartheid to modern day South Africa, how do you think through contemporary issues of racism, whether in South Africa, the US, or perhaps anywhere else in the world?
I'm grateful for the people that keep pushing the Black Lives Matter movement, because it's helping the world to confront ghosts of our past. As Justice Edwin Cameron said in a case here in South Africa that is called Daniels versus Gribante, the past remains with us, and it will not leave us alone until we confront and reckon with its claim to justice. And there are claims to justice that come from our past. Key to that is the exaltation of whiteness and condemnation of Blackness. That's a global thing. And I was talking to a friend, a very good friend of mine who's white, a few days ago, because he's a good man, and because he just didn't understand what do you mean about exaltation of whiteness and condemnation of Blackness. And then when we gave examples to him, it made sense. And he started coming up with examples. But we haven't engaged in those conversations, because every time people start those conversations, the feeling is you pulling the race card. It's almost if people think that if we don't talk about it, it's going to go away. The truth is we were socially engineered to exalt whiteness and condemn Blackness. That's happening throughout. It may not have been done deliberately during our time, during your time, but certainly it was done deliberately during my time. But what has happened is that even though it wasn't done deliberately during your time, the tendencies that were learned during my time and the time before me have continued to define lives. And it's not just the condemnation of Blackness and exaltation of whiteness that is at issue. The same thing applies with the dichotomization of gender. Male is superior, nationality. Nationals are important, non-nationals are Cinderellas. And those are things that I think the Black Lives Matter movement is awakening us to. And sadly, other people's response is when you say Black Lives Matter, they say all lives matter. If all lives mattered, there would be no reason to talk about Black Lives Matter. If, for example, you said, let's end gender-based violence, and you respond to me and say, let's end all violence. The question for me would be, why would I be concerned about gender-based violence if that wasn't a problem on its own? Mm-hmm. And thank God that this movement is forcing us to engage with these things. I do think, though, that we will engage beyond statues, because even if we remove these statues, the mindsets are not going to go. The inequalities that have been entrenched by years of advantage and disadvantage are not going to go away automatically. If anything, the inequalities are going to grow because of the principles of exponentiality.
And shifting now a bit to your professional history, which is testament to your track record in being an activist on issues of constitutionalism, the rule of law, good governance, and human rights. You were one of the drafters of the South African Constitution who helped write the South African Constitution in the early 1990s. This is the Constitution that is admired across the world. Can you please briefly share with us what the main concerns and the areas that the drafters of the Constitution had and hoped the Constitution would grant South Africa's democracy, and how you think South Africa has done so far?
Thank you. I believe that the main concerns that drove the architecture of our Constitution were twofold. One was the rule of law, and the other one was social justice. The rule of law concerns can be seen in the fact that, for example, democratic governance or democracy is mentioned 25 times in the Constitution, because the way they governed was not democratic. Government did what it wanted as long as it thought it was good for the section of the community that it thought it was looking after, which was white people. Then it thought it could just govern arbitrarily. So the rule of law is an extremely important part of it. Administrative justice, section 33, becomes extremely important to the extent that our Constitution even added a new chapter in democracy, chapter 9, which introduces institutions such as the Public Protector, Human Rights Commission, Auditor General, etc., to reinforce public accountability. And that was part of the rule of law, and to make sure that those who exercise public power and control over public resources do so in accordance with the law, and they are accountable to the people for that entrusted power through multiple channels, including direct channels such as social accountability. In other words, our Constitution even creates channels for people to hold government directly accountable. And that's part of what we call open democracy, which is now been reinforced by the Protection of Access to Information Act. The other part of the Constitution, which was a break from the past, the Constitution talks about healing the divisions of the past and building a new, a united South Africa based on social justice, democratic governance, and human rights. And therefore, the idea was this new South Africa would be founded on shared humanity, shared prosperity, and substantive equality of human life. Have we done well? We have moved in the right direction. If we talk about, for example, democratic governance, even though we've complained about state capture, corruption, incompetence, etc., there are structures and processes that keep bringing government back on track, and these are working. That's why we are where we are at this stage. And even during my time as Public Protector, I had full confidence that the architecture is able to withstand any wind that threatens the sustainability of our democracy. When it comes to social justice, we've done fairly well with combating discrimination, but with regard to advancing equality, I think the UK is doing better, which is weird because they don't have a constitution like us. They have an written constitution, but they have an Equality Act that specifically requires government to consider, before applying any law, before creating any law, they have to make sure that that law complies with the equality duty. That is, making sure that it treats everyone equally, substantively, not just a formal equality, and that it also advances equality. Where there is pre-existing inequality, new laws should reduce existing inequalities. I'm not saying the UK is more equal than us. I'm just saying, legally speaking, we are at a place where we're not in a good space. We rushed for BEE, and I don't think BEE was bad, but I think it wasn't the full answer. Employment equity, on the other hand, was good because it covers everyone. It's not just looking at the Black middle class, it covers everybody. Where we went wrong was we abandoned the Equality Act, that was supposed to reverse the legacy of inequality, which covered all sectors of society. There's a book called Verwoerd, written by the grandchild of Verwoerd, the architect of apartheid. He talks about the fact that the idea under apartheid was to socially engineer inequality in all areas of life, to make sure that your dimensions of inequality reinforce each other. Your Land Act, job reservation, education, health, space, spatial disparities, everything was working together to prop white people up and to pull Black people down. You then, to dismantle that, you need laws and policies that touch all of those areas of life. To only touch employment and commerce does not really do justice.
Okay. And you're, of course, the former public protector in South Africa, and you held the role for a term of 7 years. The role is constitutionally appointed. What are the main lessons that you learned in that role about implementing the Constitution, since the Constitution is not self-executing? And what did you also learn about democratic governance and the rule of law in general that you can share with the rest of the African continent, which is sometimes stereotypically associated with corruption?
Yes. Well, firstly, Africa is not the only corrupt continent, and it also doesn't corrupt itself. It's big business. And where does big business come? It comes from all over the world. But I don't want to go in that direction. I just do think that a good constitution is a good starting point. For example, when I look at the Kenya constitution and the South African constitutions, these two constitutions have been important tools for transformative democracy. And therefore, just for African countries that are looking at advancing the well-being of everyone in society, advancing peace, because ultimately you're trying to create a society where there's peaceful coexistence. And in a society where other people feel governed unfairly, where other people feel left behind, peace is threatened. Because as long as there's injustice somewhere, there can't be sustainable peace anywhere. So a good constitution is important. But secondly, electing the right people to govern is equally important. When we're thinking about who do we put in public power, we should think about the most competent, the most trustworthy, and the least selfish. And if people were not competent, they were not trustworthy, they were selfish before they went into government, those tendencies are going to be multiplied when you give them power. Because in government, it's entrusted power, and entrusted power is exercised in private. We don't get to see everything that is done in our name, and people who are untrustworthy before you put them in government will be worse if you put them in government. So you need people who are competent, trustworthy, and selfless. Thirdly, it is important that you maintain public accountability and public involvement. And one of the mistakes we make in our continent and also in the world is that we all focus on elections. Let's elect people, and if they disappoint us, let's take them out. No, that's not enough. Let's make sure that once they are on the other side, if we have good ideas, and Africa doesn't only is not only rich in the fact that it is it's a young continent. Africa is a young continent. The majority of its people, I think 70% of the population, are people who are under 35. That is a resource. That resource should not just only be elected into government. These people are important in innovations that can be used to govern better. Leverage technology to make sure that service delivery is developmental and that service delivery reaches everyone. Leverage technology to advance transparency in governance, because as I said earlier, sunshine is the best disinfectant. And some of the technology that young people are inventing can be used to advance democracy. And then just lastly, when it comes to corruption, we have to say no to corruption, even when it is taking place in very micro places or micro spaces. From traffic cops and traffic officers to getting passports or getting permits, business permits and things like that. We have to say no to corruption, because if we don't handle what you call retail corruption, we become indifferent to corruption, and we only start getting worried when millions of dollars are involved. Again, we are own liberators when it comes to ending corruption. The courts will be there, they will help us, elections will be there, but on a day-to-day basis, we have to look at what's happening. Nip the bud before the money is gone.
So, as part of your legacy in the field of social justice and constitutionalism, you have since founded the Tuma Foundation with a mission, and I quote, to make democracy work for all. You are also now a university professor as the Law Faculty Trust Chair in Social Justice at Stellenbosch University, South Africa, teaching the next generation of lawyers. At this stage, with so many accomplishments achieved, what do you hope to still accomplish in this field of social justice, constitutionalism, and human rights?
The most important thing is to see real change in people's lives. I'm fortunate to have been part of drafting a groundbreaking constitution whose main features are creating an architecture for the rule of law and advancing social justice. I've been fortunate to be part of drafting laws to make that a reality and to push back against corruption and incompetence, which could have derailed our constitutional project. It's time to climb another mountain now, to work with ordinary people, particularly young people, to boost democracy, reboot democracy, and make it work for all. Our areas of emphasis right now is democracy, education, and leadership, particularly training young people around leadership that is ethical, purpose-driven, impact-conscious, and committed to serve. Because if you look at what has happened in the last 26 years of democracy, there's been a lot of goodwill. Yes, there's been corruption, but the majority of people have sought to do the right thing. The weakness has been around purpose-driven and impact-conscious governance and leadership. And this is what we want to inculcate in civil society, at local government, and in government. And we've started to do that. We do democracy dialogues, we do training on epic leadership. We also train civil society around sustainable development with a view to understanding that when people are hungry, it's difficult for them to think about lofty ideals of democracy, rule of law, and anti-corruption. And when you help them to help themselves around sustainable development, then you create some kind of baseline against hunger, against poverty, that allows people to start thinking about lofty ideals of sustainable democracy, the rule of law, anti-corruption, and human rights. That's what I'm doing at the level of the Tuma Foundation, which is Thuli Madonsela Foundation. At the level of the university, we are inviting South Africans and the world to join us in putting together a plan for social justice. It's like the post-World War II Marshall Plan for Europe recovery. Ours is called the Plan for Social Justice. It's based on a girl who was arrested at 12 years old in June 1976, who's poor in democratic South Africa. And we're asking ourselves, why would this hardworking person be poor in democratic South Africa when she has sacrificed for democracy and freedom? And the Musa Plan for Social Justice is about all hands on deck to adopt social justice through leveraging data analytics for predictive policy design to make sure that we are impact conscious when we design our policies. If we want policies that will advance equality, let's know in advance if our policies will advance equality and if our policies will advance sustainable development, if our policies will also help us to fight back against hunger and poverty. We also looking at getting everyone to fund the equality project, because we think that even if there was no corruption and even if there was no ineptitude, there wouldn't be enough resources to bridge the gap that was created by patriarchy, colonialism, apartheid, disability discrimination, and all forms of inequality in the past that remain with us, not because of the law, but because of the social consequences of the unjust laws of the past.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Madonsela, for this opportunity to have such an extensive discussion. And I look forward to a face-to-face sit-down interview, hopefully, when everything returns to normal. But for now, thank you for this virtual discussion and for lending your voice and sharing your valuable insights on current global events, as well as a historical backdrop upon which some contemporary issues are founded upon. And if anyone wants to learn more about you and the work that you do, Professor Madonsela, I will link Professor Madonsela's Twitter account to this video. And to everyone watching, thank you for watching and see you soon.
Thank you.